All right. I'd say we'd get started. I'll just switch off the light, in the hopes that you can see that much better than at the moment. Okay. Brilliant. Let's get started. So today we're going to I'm going to finally finish talking about gender. I'm going to shove in femininities and masculinities. So we are going to do a rough theoretical overview over both, and then we're going to come back to Lady Chatterley's lover. I'm not quite sure how we're going to manage that or how I'm going to manage it, but generally that's the plan for today. I think last week I kind of left off with some weird comment on phrenology and on the shape and size of skulls and what it kind of tells us about othering and social practices. So just to kind of sum it up, we left off with othering, and othering sort of simply, and I'm just going to mute that for a second, simply means that there are certain physiological, biophysical traits that are being used in order to legitimize social differences. Also, if it's too warm, we can open the windows if you like. You need a key for that. So, yeah, you need to kind of...
You're kind of scared that you jump out of the window.
I think they're probably more scared that, someone will take that incredible, not, set up, lovely overhead projector and take it with them. Not quite sure. Or that someone will take the desk with them. Anyways, if it gets too loud, we need to close it. But I think if it's in the back of the room, that should be fine. I'll just need to briefly open the live stream so that I can actually see if people are writing something in the chat. Or you could have kept the key for a moment if you like, but you can. Now you're in the middle of the room.
No, I don't know what it is.
It's Monday evening. It was a very hot weekend, don't worry about it. Everyone is a bit confused, I think. All right, hi. Don't be sorry, that's fine. Okay. Now I'm set up, now we can start. Brilliant. Okay, so again, othering the phrenology comment was simply because, particularly in the 19th century, people thought that the shape and the size of skulls told us quite a bit about the people, whether it's a criminal or whether it's an adulterous husband. That was usually determined by the shape of their faces, by the shapes of their skulls. So what othering usually does is it takes a biophysical trait that is simply a constitution of difference. Someone has blonde hair, someone has dark hair, someone has this and that shape of a nose. That usually doesn't tell us anything at all. It isn't othering, it is simply that someone looks different. But othering is the attribution of social difference to it. Basically the link between that biophysical trait, for instance, and a certain social difference. You see that when it comes to especially the depiction of Jews in the 1930s. They had dark hair, a hooked nose, etc., etc. These biophysical traits were simply used in order to say, these physical traits legitimize us to have not physical, but political and social repercussions attributed to a certain group of people, for instance. And you see the depiction of people in that way, in particular Jews in that way, throughout history. From Ebenezer Scrooge, who is simply portrayed as someone with a hooked nose, certain biophysical traits, certain characteristics, he's greedy, he's to do with money, he's not quite a banker, but he is kind of this, a sort of a shark when it comes to flats and renting flats and so on and so forth. You have the same thing with Gringotts. The goblins are usually described as having hooked noses, sharp teeth, dark slick hair, etc., etc. So there are certain biophysical traits that are being used over and over again, and these not only legitimize but also point towards a certain social difference that is artificially attributed. So simply because you have those features doesn't necessarily mean that you are greedy, that you have those essential characteristics. Do you have a question?
No,
I wanted to ask is that like many Disney villains have like these features?
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
I don't know how she's called from Snow White. The like.
Yeah, absolutely. Disney villains have that. They are either queer-coded, with Scar, for instance, or Ursula. They're either that, or they have those physical attributes that kind of point towards them. You know, dark hair, dark eyes. They're not pretty, etc., etc. So there's always this sort of attribution of social difference that comes with these traits. And that is done in many ways, from skin color to the shape of skulls. The shape of your skull doesn't tell you anything about your character, but these ideas and these differences are essentialized in some form. They are, or they become characteristics you have to fulfill in order to fulfill a certain social function. And that is essentially othering, the attribution of social difference on traits that have no inherent behavioral consequence whatsoever. And coming back to, from othering to sort of the question of gender, and I think that was the kind of the link I wanted to make, even though that was a very long detour through othering. But usually when it comes to the othering of women and men, that's the same thing. Certain biophysical attributes are being used in order to infer a certain characteristics, in order to infer a certain behavioral standard. Because women are like this, they are not as muscular, they are not as tall, they must be weak. And this weakness is then inferred to certain social characteristics. If they are weak in their physical traits, they are usually also weak in their mental traits. And this is sort of the process of othering that is going on when it comes to gender binaries. There are certain traits that are being essentialized. And this is especially when we talk about identity construction. I'm not quite sure if I mentioned it. Have I covered essentialism with you at the moment? The thing is, that's the problem with teaching 2 seminars. You're kind of confused what you've covered and what you haven't. I know that I've covered.
I don't think so.
Okay, not this semester, good. So essentialism, you've heard of it, potentially, in some seminar, mentioned. Anyone knows what essentialism kind of, especially when it comes to gender identity and identity in general, what it means? What could it mean? Katharina?
Was it that certain features are described as natural and that it is thought that they are basically the norm, and no, it's not the norm. That it, just that they are natural and they cannot be changed.
Yes, absolutely.
And that identity is a fixed thing. It's
exactly.
Yeah.
It's that certain characteristics are essentially in order to be socially intelligible as something. So in order to be socially readable as a woman, you have to have certain characteristics. And if you're a woman, you need to embody certain characteristics also. So there is the idea that, again, women are weak, they are more emotional, etc., etc. These are essential characteristics you need to embody as a woman, on the one hand, in order to be read as a woman. And if you are a woman, you need to be, showing that on the outside. So essentialism simply means that certain characteristics are seen as fixed and as always there, and as Katharina said, as natural or normal for a certain identity category. And these characteristics stay roughly the same across time and space, so to speak. So it doesn't matter if you're a woman or a man in the 19th century or in the 21st century, the characteristics stay roughly the same, or not even roughly the same, but definitely the same over the years. You're always passive, demure, and weak, or you're active and aggressive and, testosterone driven. That sort of stays the same. And that would be essentialism, very broadly speaking, and very, very generalized. And again, when it comes to gender differences, we see these essentialist ideas cropping up time and time again, whether it's the 1950s housewife or whether it's nowadays that there are certain ideals of womanhood and of femininity that women ought to embody in certain contexts. And these beliefs, and that is something we've covered last week, kind of extensively, more extensively than I had anticipated, is that these essentialist beliefs about women and about men are still being used in order to, on the one hand, sort of construct even more difference. Women and men are treated, and I think we, where's the cursor? Here we go. and we covered that when we talked about boys and girls. These ideas, you know, boys or girls tend to have better listening skills, attention to detail. Men don't. Women are usually not as confident, men are. These are essentialist categories, essentialist ideas about gender, and they have a lot of the potential to be very troubling, because this is, and I think I mentioned that already, gender is learned and gender is collaborative. These are exactly things that are being taught, and this is the problematic part if we have these essentialist ideas about gender identity, namely that we teach that to others. And eventually those others, in particular children for whom we do gender for the first couple of years, they will take these things up. They will think that is normal, that is natural. Women have to behave in a certain way. Men have to behave in a certain way. And I think, and this is something that I'm trying, or I want to cover today, is that this is particularly the case with women. And we know, especially when it comes to you know, feminist movements, there has been a sort of breakup of these essentialist ideas. We know now that women aren't always demure, aren't always weak or emotional or good at listening and all of these things that we covered last week. That this is basically a lot of bullshit, really. But while we know that about women, the process of knowing that about men, and again, there's only, I'm sorry about that. It's always good to have something about masculinity being taught by a woman while you're sitting there and go like, great. Anyways, bear with me on that front. But generally, we don't really know that about men, because this sort of this conversation about men and masculinities has only started recently as the 1980s can be, but generally in the last decade at least we had a lot more conversation about the question of toxic masculinity, about hegemonic masculinity, about what it means to be a man, and that manhood is somehow in crisis. That's something we're going to cover later on. But again, these essentialist ideas like focus on movement or do well with mathematical problems, that isn't the case for each and every man as much as it isn't the case for each and every woman, but these are identity categories and fixed ideas about gender that we have and that we teach. And I think I already kind of covered that. That is sort of the question, or there are 5 points that we can sort of generally say about gender. Gender is performed, it is learned, it is collaborative, it is asymmetric, and it's ubiquitous. I'm not going to cover the ubiquitous point too much, because gender is something we deal with each and every day, whether it's, again, whether it's education, whether it's in university, whether it's in your job sort of or professional life. Gender always kind of plays a role. You know, I know the question isn't asked any longer, but if you apply for a job, one of the questions in one of the job interviews could still be, you know, do you plan on being pregnant? Do you plan on, you know, or are you planning a family? That is not necessarily something you would ask a man, because it is assumed that men, you know, they don't take parental leave, or at least not this kind of longish parental leave. But for women, that's definitely something that's still being asked, or at least implied, which is and can be a problem. We also see that at university when it comes to people kind of, especially sexual harassment cases. These are still rife at universities. We see gender more or less everywhere in our daily life, and it kind of influences us in some form in our daily life. So I'm not going to deal with that too extensively. On the side of collaborative, I've kind of covered that already. That is simply that people do gender for someone in the first couple of years. I think last week we kind of talked about children's clothes, and that this is already kind of color-coded, and you're being asked, is it for a girl or is it for a boy? And what it is with play or kind of toys and plushies and all of these things, these are already gender-coded in a way. And again, children don't really think about gender in the first couple of years, but they eventually learn that by the age of 3 that there are certain differences. On the question of gender is asymmetric, there is a power hierarchy within our society, and it's not always as steep as some feminist readings want to make it out, but we do live in a patriarchal society where men do generally hold more economic, more cultural power than women do. So there's always an implied power hierarchy between men and women. And I hope I have that quote here. Maybe also on the term of gender is learned. I think, I'm not quite sure whether I covered that quote last week, but I think I noted or I touched upon the interpolation or being called into a certain gender identity basically at the moment of birth or very quickly after birth, when they say, oh, it's a girl, and you name it this, that, and the other. And just as a quote to kind of sum that up, there is a quote by Foster Sterling who says that labeling someone a man or a woman is a social decision. So there is no inherent biologic, or at least in general, there is no inherent biological physicality that tells you it's one or the other. Of course, we have covered that, you know, with medical prototypes. There is certainly, but this labeling and these prototypes are very much social categories. We may use scientific knowledge to help make the decision, again, those medical stereotypes, not stereotypes, but prototypes, but only our beliefs about gender and not science can define our sex. Furthermore, our beliefs about gender affect what kind of knowledge scientists produce about sex and gender, in this case, in the first place. So if I presume as a scientist that women are inherently weak and stupid and emotional, and they are not muscular, and they're not strong, and they're none of these things, then my research into that topic will probably be very biased already. So I will look for, you know, correlations and you know, sort of correlations in these things that will prove my point that women are weaker, for instance. I think, again, 19th century, there were a number of studies being done on the brain capacity of white people and BIPOC people, and what they covered or what they discovered, white scientists, of course, that of course the brain capacity of people, of non-white people, was smaller than the ones of white people, simply because they measured the volume of their brain cavities, of their skull cavities, they measured the circumference of brains, etc., etc., and that was used as scientific knowledge, produced scientific knowledge, that this was actually the truth, which was then used in order to legitimize, for instance, that people of color couldn't work in certain professions. This is what I mean with the bias about your face says, what the fuck is going on? But that is sort of the link. If you are biased in the first place and you're not aware of these biases, which can happen, you produce knowledge that can be or often is already biased in the first place. So this is just a brief comment on that. So when it comes to women or femininities, for instance, there was, for the longest time, there was this held notion that women or therapy on women couldn't be done because there was no way women could enter therapy and come out on the other end being sort of helped and mentally well. So Freud, for instance, notes when he looks at women, he sees nothing. He was very focused on the male psyche for the longest time, and eventually just, you know, go back to Alfred Kinsey and his Kinsey report. The first one is about male sexual behavior, and female sexual behavior is only this kind of afterthought that comes later, a couple of years later, in this case. Same thing with Freud, same thing with a lot of scientific movements in the 19th and 20th century and earlier. Male experiences were usually used as the scientific benchmark, not so much female experiences. So everything that was female reproduction was kind of male, but different. So this is kind of the bias that we have when we do science or, you know, academic research, for instance. Bless you. Moving on, and I think I do have that. So what does that say about women and the asymmetric relationship between women and men? And I usually use these sort of 1950s advertisements about, you know, the usual Hausfrau or stay-at-home mom. So this is a certain power hierarchy that was rather pervasive for the longest time. It's 3 advertisements. One is, I think, coffee. No, I think 2 is coffee, and 1 is some kind of way of reforming your body image in order to attract your mate or your soulmate or a man, mostly man. This goes more into the direction of, or that kind of assumes all of these 5 points. Gender is ubiquitous, It is performed, so there are certain gender roles. In particular, I like the woman kneeling in front of her husband's bed while he's wearing a tie. That's how you obviously go to bed in the 1950s. Not quite sure about that. But generally, this goes into the direction of gender roles are performed and they are learned. So if you see these advertisements, you immediately know what your position as a woman will be in society. Namely, subservient, only made for male satisfaction, male pleasure, and whatever this is, definitely not the most healthy kind of relationship. Also, this is, and we're talking about the 1950s, 60s, and 70s here, this is the pervasive idea about the woman. You shouldn't work. If you work, then it's kind of menial work, it's secretary work, it's not, you're not working in, in industry complexes, in factories, etc., etc. But and this is, of course, the middle class ideal or the upper class ideal of a woman that is the housewife. It's kind of very similar to the angel of the house in the 19th century, like Victorian age. A woman should be nice and pleasant to look at, but generally should be seen but not heard. And this is something that goes on. However, in the 1950s, 60s in particular, after the Second World War, we have much more of a focus towards commodification of the domestic. So we have the rise of the TV. TV becomes this kind of furniture, but also this kind of leisure activity, both for men and for women. But mostly everything to do with the domestic sphere is marketed straight towards women, of course, always with that sort of gender perspective concern or connected to it, and it's a man's world and so on and so forth. But generally enough, everything concerning the domestic sphere is marketed very much towards women. And if you don't conform to these ideals, well, at least in the 1950s and 60s, there's a remedy for it. Namely, you could drink something infused with coca plants, or with morphium, or with heroin, or you could simply drink a lot of alcohol in order to sort of keep calm and banish depression. It's that easy. Here you've heard it first. Just drink a lot of alcohol and then you can again perform that gender role that society kind of wants you to. I like that you're nodding, kind of like, yeah, good idea actually. Yeah. I think one of the examples is, for instance, Coca-Cola, that was with, infused with coca plants, was actually marketed towards women and to make them more compliant, for instance, and more upbeat, especially because kids are murder and your husband is at work and you need to do something with your time at home. So this is a very strange rendition of the hysteria. So either you're, 19th century, you're reading, you are not conforming to gender ideals, you're being put into an asylum, or you're being kind of locked away from others. But in the 1950s, you're being kind of infused with alcohol and other substances that make you more conforming to gender ideals and roles, and the role of a upbeat housewife who serves her husband in this case. I think you all know the 1950s, The Good Housewife's Guide, that was pretty popular a couple of years ago, and being reused, where if your husband comes home, you need to serve him, the children need to be calm, you need to have dinner ready, you need to, give him time to relax while you prepare everything and make it as easy for him as possible, and so on and so forth. I always kick that out. Maybe I should leave that in. Okay, what we see here is, and we see that here also, both with regards to body images, we see that, which is kind of kinky, but also kind of not, just mostly weird. But we also see it here in some form, but mostly here on that picture, the one with the men wouldn't look at me when I was skinny type. There is a weird inherent sexualization even of the housewife. Sometimes you have this very, nowadays, especially when you see depictions of the housewife or the stay-at-home mom, there's always the kind of, she's not sexy, she needs a makeover, she's kind of frumpy. This wasn't exactly the case. So we see both with the way they dress, also the way maybe not this one, but generally in those advertisements you see a kind of weird connection between femininity and sexualization, something we see nowadays also. There is the idea not only nowadays or in the 19th century or in between, but that female sexuality in particular needs to be contained in some form, needs to be more rigidly contained also, but there's also the idea that women are inherently sexual objects. And we'll get to objectification in a moment. I'm just going to go back to this picture. This is something we see time and time again, whether it's nowadays or whether it's previously sex cells, or at least sexual objectification cells. And that's not so much done with men as it is with women. And objectification, and here we talk in particular about visual media, and I'm so sorry, but I'll be talking a lot today, obviously. I mean, you obviously know objectification. I'm male gaze, everyone's nodding. How well do you know it? Or is it something, is it one of these things you've heard but are not quite sure what it means and how it works? Or is it something you're pretty familiar with and it's not something new that I'm going to tell you in about 5 minutes? Yes?
I don't know what you're going to tell us, so I don't know if I know it already.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover objectification of women. Like there's a list of 7 points of how to objectify a woman. That sounds like a 101 on how to objectify women. Oh wow, no, sorry, that wasn't it. But yes, and objectification in the sense of what is the male gaze, how does it work? You know it?
Just say it again, I would say.
All right, I'll just...
Don't know the 7 steps.
I just need to... You want to know the steps, all right. Let me just... Okay. So talking about sexual objectification and the male gaze, in this case, is, well, objectification very broadly is simply the objectification, and I'm going to explain it with the word objectification. It's basically not treating a woman as a subject with someone with real agency, etc., but with, is it that? Oh no, sorry, I just thought you want to leave. It's like, oh no, it's that. No, okay. But it's usually treating a woman more of an object, a sexual object that is viewed at with pleasure and taking away her agency instead of like treating her like a human being, but treating her like someone or something you can possess, something that has no agency, etc., etc. And as I said, there are 7 ways, or at least Martha Nussbaum has come up with, after a pretty extensive discourse analysis of how women are represented in the media, she has come up with roughly 7 ways of how to treat women as an object, and it sounds very much like a 101 of how to do that. But these 7 steps are the following: it's instrumentality, the denial of autonomy, the inertness, etc., etc. So I'm not going to read them out, but there are a couple of ways and a couple of strategies on how to treat women as objects. What we see relatively often, and this is something where I go back to this particular picture, it's women aren't, you know, they aren't in any form subjects here. Here we have a reduction to the body. A woman needs to look a certain way in order to be read as a woman and to be perceived as attractive. Here, the woman needs to fulfill a certain function, namely in function of servitude in some way. In this case, a woman is more of an object or a possession that can be punished if she doesn't conform to whatever the man in this case or whatever society wants. We see that here also with the regard to alcohol in a way, and the regard to how to be a good woman. You need to be doing something if you can't perform this role in some way. This is reduction to the body, reduction to the appearance, the silencing in particular. It's always nice to have that list in mind if you look at visual media in particular. My favorite example is Megan Fox in the Transformers franchise. I think you all, I saw the reaction of, oh God. So you probably all know where she kind of glistens and leans over the car. That is a reduction to body and appearance. The silent, yes?
Yeah, maybe like also a good scene is like how the queen is portrayed in the first Suicide Squad and then in her own movie.
Yeah.
Like those are very different.
Same character, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, absolutely. Also, yes?
Also, I think there's a big difference between the comic book. The comic book, she has a full-on jumper. You can see an ounce of the skin.
Yep.
Just, I think you can see her face and not
You can see her face,
head, and that was it.
Yeah.
Also, I think in many media there's like fan service. If,
Yeah.
maybe a series or something is more tailored to guys watching it, so there will be a lot of boobs. I watch anime, so there's always a lot of fan service for guys.
That was also what I was thinking of. I was also thinking of Transformers, how to make a female Transformer, give them boobs. That's basically it.
Yeah.
But yeah, actually what I was going, thank you for the comments. What I was going for was the silencing, especially when it comes to female superheroes. There are films where female superheroes are pretty much silenced by their male counterparts. You see that, I think the last reading exercise we did, women are very much silenced. Men talk about them, but they don't talk to them. Women are generally, they don't have, in some series, and some series I have watched, you don't know it, but you know, trust me that I'm right on that front. There are 4 women in the series, only one has a first name. The other ones are unnamed. They are called Resident 1, 2, and 3, and they don't have any speaking lines except for oh and oh no. So that's that.
Isn't there also something called, I think it's called vector test for like movies or series, where there has to be like 2 women speaking about something else than a man, and then and
most movies fail the Bechdel test.
I watched Lord of the Rings for another seminar, and I was like, I didn't see a woman here. I saw a woman like getting killed or not talking.
Yeah, Eowyn, usually Arwen. She usually only talks about Aragorn or to Aragorn, and then stares vacantly off into space. Yeah. Not so much in the books actually, but in the films certainly. She's this sort of otherworldly. What seminar did you take where you had to watch Lord of the Rings?
A seminar by Mrs. Miller.
Ah.
Then last year was, I think, what was it? Eco-criticism.
That's pretty nice. Neat.
We had to watch 2 Towers.
Oh my god, you had to watch it. That's terrible. Okay. Moving on, but yes, absolutely, we have the reduction of women to men or their relation to men. So again, going back to the reading exercise of last week, she is the wife of someone. She doesn't have a name by her own, but she is kind of made real by the name of her husband, for instance. We have the denial of subjectivity that goes into that direction. It's not just silence, but how are they named? Do they have a first name? Do they have a designation other than their husband's name or being the wife of someone? Ownership, that is the treatment of a person as something that is owned by another, especially with, I want to say, 1980s and 90s rom-coms, where the woman is a prize to be won, it's a possession to be had, something that gives you a certain status as a man, but she's not really a subject in herself. So she isn't valued for her opinions. In fact, most of their opinions she's made fun of for. So these are certain steps that visual media sort of engage in, and men engage in, also women, by the way, engage in order to objectify other women. So usually, and this is something that Nussbaum also says, that women are being objectified by others, but they also objectify themselves because they're aware that your appearance matters. So you start eventually, it's not a conscious process often, but you start to take on these norms. So you start to care for your appearance and your body simply because you know that this matters. This is your, it's not your economic capital, but it's certainly cultural capital that you have. Your erotic capital, your physical capital is your body and a certain appearance of it. And again, objectification can work both, from the side of men. So men do objectify women, but women do the same thing. So especially when it comes to the denial of subjectivity, women engage in these strategies just as much as men do. But that is mostly a sort of societal question in societal structures that we see here. And one of these strategies in order to do that in visual media in particular is the male gaze. And this is where we go to the concept of it and the strategies of objectification in particular in visual media. And I should have probably added some, no I don't. I don't have any screenshots for you, so again, you need to believe me and bear with me on that front. The gaze, in a way, is generally, and this is one of the early questions, it's simply the act of looking, but looking is not always an innocent act. It's not something you simply do, but that has always repercussions when it comes to power. So if we look at films in particular, films are being made by certain production teams. Films are being made by cameramen, and usually cameramen, in this case, like literally cameramen. Producers are often male. So some of the films and some of the visual representation caters to a certain male gaze. However, the male gaze is not just the way of men looking at women, but it is the form or the way of sexualizing women in particular. Again, here I'm referring to just keep in mind Megan Fox, how she kind of is portrayed while she tries to repair the car in Transformers 1. And in some form, the way the camera looks at women in this way, the way the women are staged, the way or the spaces women are situated in, that helps with the helps with the objectification of women in a ritualized way. So there are questions, especially in film studies, is there something like a female gaze? And particularly in the last couple of years, there has been this question, is there something like a female gaze that objectifies men? And the answer is not quite, because the male gaze and the objectification of women points towards a structural problem. There are films that highlight, the male form and objectify men, but it's the systemic objectification of a particular gender that the male gaze points to. And the concept was introduced by Laura Mulvey in 1975, and she argues basically that films respond to this sort of deep-seated gender power balance or imbalance, in this case in our society, that privileges men and does not privilege women. This is exactly what the male gaze kind of visualizes, namely a certain way of framing women, namely by reducing them to their appearance or to their body, by showcasing their bodies in a certain way. It is a very different shot, in the Transformers movies, to see Megan Fox maybe in a long shot where she is part of their surroundings, or to have the camera track up basically her upper body and her her ass in a way, and her bodily features. That's something completely different, and that's the way the male gaze works. It's the way women's bodies are put on scene and how they are staged in a particular way. And that tends to reinforce, generally, that women are reduced to their bodies and to their relation to men. So the camera, in this case, enacts the male gaze, panning up and down women's bodies, a body in pieces. So Megan Fox isn't shown in full, but she's shown in face, chest, booty, basically, and moving in for close-ups of various fragments of the female body, especially the face, and thus creating the object qua object, so the object because of it. Also, with regards to what she represents for the hero, again, I'm just going to go back before you stare at the quote. Again, when it comes to Megan Fox, she's not so much there as her own character, but as a function for the main character, whose name I've forgotten actually. Anyways, not important, but generally that's she has a function within the story for the hero, the damsel in distress who needs to be saved, or someone who has the right idea at the right moment so that she can help the hero to progress in his own story and his own character development and character arc. So what counts is what the heroine provokes, or rather what she represents. She is the one, or rather the love or fear that she inspires in the hero, or else the concern he feels for her, who makes him act the way he does. In herself, the woman has not the slightest importance. And that is not the case for every movie, but that is the case for some movies in particular, and those are movies where the male gaze can be traced or can be seen in its fullest form in this case. Do you have any questions so far? Okay. Oh yeah, I did have something. That was mostly on the question of, is there something like a female gaze? Again, it's the systemic representation of women in a certain way, and what if all the male characters posed like the female ones in the Marvel Avengers universe? That would be certainly different. And this is a very pixelated image, but generally you would get the gist of it. Yes?
Do you know the new series Mrs. Marvel on Disney Channel? It's like
I know about it. I haven't seen it so far.
Yeah, it's about I don't know, about a little girl. I think they maybe thought we don't have enough female representation, and she's also of color, because they probably also don't have enough representation of color. And it would all be okay if it wasn't for the storyline being like a high school movie, and the protagonist sings and dances through her apartment after she meets her crush. I think it's so. It's like a new thing. I don't know why they do all these high school movie things for it being a Marvel thing. And there's emojis flying around, and she's dancing because she just has her crush, and it's all so girly, and I don't know why they would do that. They wouldn't do that if it was a male, if it was Mr. Marvel or something like that.
Mr. Marvel.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, Spider-Man wouldn't do that. I mean, he's a bit quirky, but not as this. Yeah.
It really bothers me because
there are certain I think that has to do with gendered expectations that we have when it comes to movies. So I just had to think of High School Musical, which is, I mean, I don't know, but Troy, I mean, sure, he dances. Why we are getting into High School Musical? Anyways, but he dances, but it's not that he has talked to his crush and then he's just completely, super happy about it. So there's especially when it comes to teenagers, we have certain expectations in visual media that need to be met. And there are very few representations that break with that. I think one of the representations that I can just think of at the top of my mind is Red. It's also a Disney Plus kind of, where she turns into this red panda. If you haven't seen it, it's brilliant. I mean, that's a recommendation, but it's I saw that and I thought, this is much more the teenager experience I know than, for instance, this sort of dancing around because you've seen your crush. That's not exactly what I've done. It was mostly the, oh my god, this was so awkward, I'm dying, and then I just kind of... But so there are certain representations, but the funny part is that usually the reviews on these movies are like, this is not a natural experience, this is not how teenage girls act. And it's like, have you met teenage girls before? Have you been one? Then yes, this is kind of what it is. So I think it has mostly to do with the expectations we bring towards it, and it doesn't really matter whether, it's the kind of also the question of accessibility. It's a series about a girl, so you need to shoehorn that in. You can't make her asexual or completely uninterested in boys at the age of, what is she, 15, 16, something?
Yeah.
I mean, you might be interested in boys, you might be interested in nothing at all, but that's not really what we expect. On the one hand, superhero movies to work, but also on the other hand, how we expect teenage girls to work like they're machines, weirdly. Michelle.
I also think that I think there are some things where there is a female gaze. We have talked about we like to do K-pop, and it's always especially boy groups are literally not focused on abs and thighs and everything. I think that's for male gaze, but also for male gaze, I already think of because I like animes, the overpowered character is always male, and he always has to save a girl from in tentacle thing, and I was that's a very difficult.
So my knowledge about anime does not extend Digimon and Jeanne d'Arc and all of these things. So it's sorry but that's interesting.
Oh my God,
it's the damsel in distress. That's probably one of the.
Also, this anime Johnny Kamikaze. The first thing she says is beautiful and strong. The first thing is beautiful. She has to be beautiful, so she can have that.
I mean, the moment we talk about age, which will come later in I think, the next session, the session after that, this is where, you know, the appearance and the reduction to appearance becomes really important again, because that is vital in some form for women, because that is your physical capital. And women, especially also with girls, you look pretty. It's also a form of reduction, because it kind of tells you it's important to look good so that people react positively to you. One of the examples would also be, we do that with teenage girls also. Millie Bobby Brown, for instance, a couple of years ago, she was 13 and people said, you know, she looks really sexy in this dress. And it's like, what the fuck, people? She's like, I mean, also her Instagram was kind of flooded with really racy stuff when she turned 18, because suddenly she was an adult and they could do that to her. Yeah.
There also was, I think, for her, for Millie Bobby Brown, and for like Emma Watson, there was a countdown, I heard.
Yeah, until she turned 18.
Birthday, because until their 18th birthday, paparazzis were not allowed to shoot under the girls or anything. So there was a countdown for many, like, young, also the older girls. There was a countdown for their 18th birthday, because until then it's like child pornography, and until after 18 it's like okay for paparazzis to, I don't know, take real photos of girls.
That is incredibly cringy and incredibly problematic, because that's something, and this is because going back to the question of female gaze, I mean, there are certainly movies that do focus a lot on the male form. For a weird moment, I had to think of Twilight every time Jacob undresses, and everyone's like, so this would be an appreciation of the male form. You have other films where you know, or Chris Evans, who tends to sometimes undress. Yes?
No, sorry. But I think that's what the men think the female gaze is. So that.
Thank you. Yes.
They think like, whoa, I want to look like that. Maybe women want me to look like that. I think like that bod is way more attractive than the pumped up gym girl.
I think one of the things I thought of was Zac Efron when he was shooting one of his documentaries, and people were like, oh my god, he has a dad bod now, and he still looked pretty ripped, but like a normal human being, like a normal guy, and not so much like the sort of incredibly chiseled physique that people think is appropriate. Yes?
Yeah, like maybe in addition to that, I think like female gaze is not really a visual thing, but like a storytelling thing.
Yeah.
So like it's more of a, yeah, we like guys or generally people who have like maybe a bit flawed background and just like have this redemption arc of some kind to some. I think that's way more attractive than just abs.
Or America's ass.
Yeah.
America's ass.
Oh yeah.
That's America's ass.
Let's move on to that point. No, but this is the female gaze appreciation for the male form. Or for instance, there have been comments about female pornography being more akin to the female gaze, because you have, you know, there's this idea that women like narratives in their pornography. They don't watch pornography that doesn't have a story arc or something. And this is something that especially female pornography tries to sort of break with. On the one hand, it certainly favors, you know, a certain feminist look at pornography, also about all of these things. Anyways, and there are other films, not only pornography, that do favor the male form. But again, the female gaze is problematic because we can't, on the one hand, pinpoint it. You don't have a Megan Fox-like shot of Chris Evans. He never really kind of lasers over the car, and then you have a pan shot of his attributes. Anyways, but this is not something you do, and if you do it, then it's a one in 100 movies maybe that does it, but it's not the systemic question. Women are systemically sort of shown like that. Black Widow is always, I mean, come on, you could have done the same thing with Captain America, which of course this makes fun of. but you don't, because that's not the expectation people go in with, and that's not exactly the way of, you know, representing women in general in the media. This is something that does, or that is on the one hand systemic, so often done that it's become normal. If I had only shown you this one, would you have immediately cued on to the fact that Black Widow is shown very differently than the others? No. And this is why the male gaze works very different than the female gaze. We definitely would have known if, you know, if that would have been the, you know, real rendering of it. Then we would have known, because that's just so different. We never see men portrayed like this. But we're very familiar with that one. Yeah.
Maybe also like thinking about Marvel, like Scarlet Witch, like thinking about that she always wanted just a family and the man.
Vision.
And that was things. So thinking just that she didn't just want her family and wanted her kids and everything, it was living through.
Men want to rule the world, women just want a family. Great. Lovely message you're going to send. I mean, and then people go like, she's a very relatable villain. Yeah, of course she is, because no one of, I mean, I don't know whether you want world domination, but okay, Michelle wants world domination, but generally people really don't, and that's a you know, an abstract out there goal that you don't really strive to. But what you can understand is domesticity, family, friendship, etc., etc. But this is usually the starting point, particularly, you know, Marvel franchise, that's completely different in this case. But you know, the representation, and we're just talking about visual representation here, of course, is very, very much gendered and very biased when it comes to that. Okay, any questions concerning the male gaze, objectification, etc., etc.? Okay, then let's move on to the not so fun part, namely performance and performativity. And I presume that some, you probably know it. You definitely know it. Why am I even asking you? Okay, again, I said in the beginning, I'm just going to move on. Oh yeah, we're moving on to more pictures. Again, I said in the beginning, gender is performed and it's sort of enforced by others and done for us, you know, through representations and through family, you know, etc., etc. What I'm going to briefly touch upon again is the asymmetric relationship between genders. On the one hand, this has become far more normal, seeing women in suits, right? Okay. You would see that and you would go like, yeah, looks good, interesting, Gillian Anderson in a suit, fancy. But moving on to this one, that would usually cause an outcry. And again, here we see, could you close the window? I just hear the cars rushing by and I'm not quite sure how much the mic actually takes it up. Anyways, talking about the gender differences, this is far less normal than this. This is okay because it's male coded. Everything that is male coded is sort of seen as the implicit standard. A suit is something both okay and normal to wear for men and for women. Dresses, however, or pink or rosé, that's not so much normal for men to wear. For women, that's a totally okay outfit, but not for men. So again, femininity, female things are usually marked. They are marked as deviant, they are marked as different, and they are usually not used for men, or not used by men, because that would make them effeminate men, and effeminate men are always other men that deviate too much from our ideals of manhood that we have in society. So again, femininity in this case is marked. It is seen as, you know, being a tomboy is still okay, but being a sissy boy is not okay. So everything to do with femininity in our society is usually marked as deviant and as other and as inappropriate. However, that also points us to the question of, and here I'm going to go back to this, to the question of performativity and performance. You have heard of these two terms, I presume. Could you explain the difference between them, and could you explain the terms? No. Performativity is definitely something you've heard with regard to gender, I presume. Okay. Anyone wants to have a go at it? No. Okay, I see. It's the please move on. Stop asking. Okay. Just give me 1 second. Talked about the markedness. Okay. Gender is performed and performative. This is, I'll start with performance generally. And I'm just going to move on to showing you actually the guy I'm talking about. Performance, and here I'm referring in particular to a concept by Erving Goffman. That's the one over there. Erving Goffman is a sociologist. He wrote his, theories on total institutions and on performativity, performance in the 1960s. And what he says that, and here we go back to kind of identity construction, but that's usually also applicable for gender identity in this case. So identity construction usually works as a performance, and here performance is really like a theatrical performance, and this is what Goffman starts off with his book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. So he says every social interaction is, in a way, a theater play. And in a way, it works just like, like I'm teaching. I'm currently performing the role as a teacher who's going to be looked at by a colleague. Anyways, but usually this is my role that I'm taking up. I went into this room knowing that I would be performing a certain role, the role as a teacher. And you went into this room knowing that you'd be performing the role as a student. However, for me, you're currently my audience. Literally, unfortunately. Or fortunately, depending on how you view it. But generally, I went in there with certain props, certain ways of, dressing, costumes, etc., etc. And this is something you do with every interaction. You perform a certain role depending on the context. Right now, it's teacher and student. If you go out with friends, it's friend A and friend B. If you're at home with your family, it's daughter, son, brother, sister, etc., etc. So these are all social roles you generally take up throughout your day. And with each and every of those roles comes a particular set of costumes. Sometimes that's the same one, it's not that much like a theatrical performance, but it can be. For instance, I usually don't dress like that. Surprise, surprise. So there is a certain, especially in a professional context, you do wear certain clothes in order to project a certain image. You use certain props. This, of course, kind of points to that. You are located in certain particular spaces. Would be something completely different if I'd be sitting in the first row. You are sitting right here. There is the power imbalance of the room that I'm using. You're sitting, I'm standing. I'm not really tall, but generally there is a power imbalance just by the fact that you're silent while I talk and you have to listen to me. So this is a performance. You always have a performer, you have a role that you take up depending on the context, and you have a certain audience that gives you immediate feedback. My favorite example is if I make a really bad pun and you're not laughing, I'll probably not be making that pun again, although I would certainly do that again. But generally, I know just from the way you react, you laugh, you nod, etc., etc. I have an immediate feedback in some form. So I will potentially transform and change the role I'm performing. If I'm so there are certain teacher roles, for instance, you probably know, the very friendly one, the one that's really cool, the hello, how do you do, fellow kids kind of teacher, and then you obviously know the really strict ones. So if I have a class where the friendly, how do you do, fellow kids role and shtick doesn't work, I will change it up just to adapt it to the certain audience I have. That doesn't mean I'm changing the role fundamentally, I'm just changing the role depending on the context. And sometimes these roles, and I'm talking about teacher roles here, they may become something that Erving Goffman calls second nature. So you perform that role so often and so consistently to a certain audience that it becomes natural. You don't really go into the room and say, now I'm a teacher, but you do that automatically and context independent. So that role might become so much part of your core identity, as Goffman says, that you perform it over and over again, depending or outside of these contexts. So one of the examples is that friends of mine, they have been teachers for quite some time, and every time I ask a question, they would immediately go all right, let me explain how that works. And I'm like, I'm not 12, but thank you for explaining that to me. So there are certain behavioral traits you take up from these roles and perform them in your daily life simply because they have become second nature. And Goffman sort of goes on that there is, you choose those roles consciously. You enter a room and you're aware, who's my audience, what are my props, what are my costumes, what am I going to perform? That is, of course, less so the case with family relations, because you have been a daughter, a son, a brother, a sister for so long that you don't consciously think about how to perform it, but you definitely perform differently for each context. And Goffman says that's pretty much a conscious choice on the one hand, and on the other hand, you always have some kind of backstage area where you can go back and be yourself. There is, presumably for Goffman at least, an area where all those roles don't matter, where you can be your core self. And going back to essentialism, this is very problematic because there is no core self, there is no you that you can find, and that there's no backstage area where you shed all the roles, because simply those roles are part of your identity generally. You don't consciously really, take them up and put them down in a way, but you definitely perform differently for each and every context. And that is quite instructive and interesting, especially when it comes to gender performance, because some of these aspects of gender identity we certainly perform. We dress a certain way for a certain context. We do perform femininity or masculinity in different contexts. Again, weird example, but friends of mine who are usually very, very, I don't want to call them feminists, but they're usually very responsible, and they don't like these manly men and these sort of rituals of manhood where you go, where you do the weird man handshake, the manly handshake. You don't hug other men, and it's just, you talk about, oh, I would kind of bang that woman, or I would like to take that woman with me at home, etc., etc. They really don't like that. But the moment they're in homosocial environments, they would inevitably do just that. So this is a conscious, more or less conscious, gender performance. You sort of more or less consciously choose how to perform in this very context. And performance in general is not an unusable sort of concept, especially for gender performance, because there are, again, certain aspects you do perform consciously. However, and this is where we move on to Judith Butler. Judith Butler says that there are things you're not conscious of. And this goes back to the list, gender is learned, performative, etc., collaborative and learned in this case. Because what Butler says is generally, and I think I do have the quote, exactly, and she says basically when it comes to gender, the act that one does, the act that one performs, is in a sense an act that has been going on before one arrived on the scene. Gender is an impersonation. Becoming gendered involves impersonating an ideal that nobody actually inhabits. So what she says is that there are certain gender roles in our society that have been there, they have transformed and developed, etc., etc., across time. And when you are born into them. You are being made a woman or a man in some form because you learn these roles and these strictures and these ideals as you move through your life. And you don't consciously choose them, because some of these things are taught to you and you perform them without being aware of the script that has been going on. And this is more or less performativity. These are not necessarily consciously chosen things you perform, but these are things that have been going on before you arrived on stage, or on the scene in this case. Just maybe I've forgotten something. Let me just briefly have a look. Yes, so more or less what unites both of these ideas of performativity and performance is that gender is always or identity production or construction is always an ongoing process. It's never something that's being done and finished, but it is something we do consciously and repeatedly. And especially with gender roles, these roles wouldn't have the same power if we only performed them once, but we do so repeatedly throughout society over and over again. Media representations do that gender work for us. They provide us with certain role models in some way that we take up. We read them, we sometimes reject some of these roles, but we take up others. And we do them again consciously or unconsciously all the time. And this repeated performance and performativity of these things, the doing of gender, kind of solidifies those gender roles in society. Because if a lot of people do it, then it's acceptable to do it, or it's legitimate to do that, to perform that, to inhabit these roles in some way. However, and this is something that Butler also knows, gender is an impersonation, so we usually learn gender by role models, whether it's family or media representations, and becoming gender involves an impersonation of an ideal nobody actually inhabits. And that kind of brings us to masculinity. And now I've spent more than enough time to talk about gender and femininity. First of all, are there any questions concerning performance and performativity? Okay, brilliant. Then I'm just going to move on. It's very warm in this room. I didn't think it would be. Okay, but moving on to, I think, yeah, masculinity. Fun. We'll be talking about toxic masculinity and hegemonic masculinity in a moment. And again, I want to point out becoming gendered, or in this case, becoming a man, involves the impersonation of an ideal that actually no one inhabits. But first, let us move on to certain ideals of manhood. I'm going to show you the pictures, but you have a choice now. Do you want to do some kind of group work with the reading exercise and look at men and masculinities, on a written text? Or would you look at pictures and kind of collect what makes a man in our society?
Pictures.
Of course, pictures.
What?
I shouldn't have given you the choice. I had a really, really bad example, chosen for you.
Oh, the good one.
You're going to do that next week. We'll be talking about age anyway, so then we can also talk about that really, really bad example. I'm going to give you a little spoiler. It's by Philip Roth and a book called Dying Animal. It's a fabulous book. If you ever want to read something and want to cringe at the end of page 1 and then go, oh, I don't want to read that, but then be so interested in it that you have to read it and then cringe throughout 2,500 pages. It's not like that. It's, I think, 300 pages. It's great. It's about a college professor who's in his 60s and who always kind of takes up really young students, which is super weird. It's incredibly cringy. It's brilliant. We're going to read an excerpt next week. It's marvelous. Also, the way he describes his students is peak disgusting. Okay, but talking about men and masculinities, what are the ideals our society holds about men in general? And you can use those pictures as an inspiration, for instance. But what are the ideals of man and manhood? Michael.
Maybe to have a healthy skin color when we see Donald Trump, maybe.
Sorry.
To have a healthy skin color, not to be orange.
I like that Indiana Jones is far more orange than other people.
Red because he has sunburn. He's also
orange. Yeah.
It's clearly orange.
It's a skin color. Next to Michelle, please.
I would say they have to be very strong and dependable, like being the breadwinner in the family and provide for their families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so like orienting on pictures, like first one, James Bond, he's like very strong, very, I would say quite smart, but like in a handsome, mysterious kind of way, or at least that's what the movie wants you to think. Then Indiana Jones, he's like adventurous, also strong, and then here I think is it Guardians of the Galaxy?
Yeah, it's Peter Quill.
Yeah, okay. Because like he is kind of funny, but also kind of strong and independent. But like also they all are strong in like a different way, but also in a manly way. And if that makes sense. Then we have Captain America, who's just like the embodiment of masculinity, I think. Because like huge muscles, and he is the hero, and he has to save everyone and stuff. Then Big Bang Theory, it's like not that of a classical masculinity, but it's more of a nerdy, and we know stuff, but we are also nerds. So that kind of masculinity. And then Trump is, I guess, more of control and having power and being like in a position of power, like
yeah, authority figure.
High up, yeah.
Okay.
So those are all different roles of masculinity, but all kind of same-ish.
Okay.
The only man in the room.
The only man. I do. For a second, I was like, do you have a name, or can? You're not talking about objectification.
Just call me playing one when I feel
The man.
No man
Resident man in the room, one.
I want to say all of them are heterosexual.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I feel like there are like 3 types of men that are seen as, I don't know, aspired, I don't know. Either they are clever and educated, like from Big Bang Theory, or they are strong and have the power to save like everyone, or they are powerful like in a political way and have money. And I think the perfect man would be someone who's everything of these named things.
Yeah.
I feel like that.
So just taking notes. Katharina.
I would underline that they are independent. It was said before, but that they are brave and that they can lead, so they can use their powers and then lead, and that they have the ability to do things, not necessarily the same things. Some are strong, some are more smart, some are of the nerdy kind, but they all do their things and they are good at it. They don't ask anyone. Yeah.
Michelle?
I also think for like Star-Lord from Guardians of the Galaxy that he's like a quirky. Also the guys from Big Bang Theory, they're funny and quirky, which I think a lot of women like that humor and something like this.
They're allowed to be humorous, which women are rarely in visual media.
I just want to ask if you're 100% sure that Rajesh is heterosexual.
Okay.
Because he has all these like feminine kind of traits and is portrayed like, because he can't get that many women in the first like in the first few seasons, so I don't know how long he can talk to women that he's got kind of like some homosexual traits.
Okay. I'm not quite sure. The thing is, I've never seen Big Bang Theory because I've only seen a couple of episodes and I hated it with a passion. So I never watched it fully, but I have seen reviews and videos about it. That's that. I'm not quite sure whether he is actually heterosexual and homosexual, but I think, especially because that is a largely homosocial environment, the lines between homo and heterosexual usually blur a little when it comes to homosocial environments.
Yeah, and Sheldon is also kind of portrayed as like asexual, I think, because he doesn't want to have like some sexual things, like not only intercourse but also kissing is like a big thing for him. The first few seasons here, I think he doesn't even think about women before he meets his girlfriend.
It's the right woman, and then she cures him of everything.
Oh yes.
Oh god.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess like Raj is just portrayed like that for laughs, I guess.
Yeah.
Because it's just haha funny. He can't talk to women. Haha. He is a virgin. That's so funny. It's hilarious. Yeah, but like also I think Star-Lord is kind of like at least a little fruity, I would say.
Okay.
Because like he makes some jokes or like some like he says some things that are a little homoerotic, I would say, but like canonically I guess he's straight, but like he's at least a little fruity, I would say.
Okay. I think that's probably the Chris Pratt problem. He always acts next to people that are either homosexual or bisexual or something. There's always this idea. Anyways, but yeah, I think Star-Lord canonically is portrayed as a heterosexual, especially with his relationship to Gamora. He tries to get the girl, and he doesn't quite get the girl. But again, especially, you know, the rest of the Guardians are men, so there's again the idea of the homosexual. Why am I pointing to Trump? This one, not that one. But that's the homosocial environment where men can be far more intimate and affectionate with each other simply because women aren't a fixture in these homosocial environments. And here again we have a sitcom. There needs to be some kind of breaking of, you know, conservative gender roles in some form simply because the genre demands it in a way. But they also, because I think he has a girlfriend at the end.
Yeah, he has some girlfriends throughout the episodes.
And that is sort of the mechanics of the sitcom where, you know, you break up this conservative idea that a man is necessarily heterosexual by teasing that he might not be or that it might be made fun of, but generally you need to contain that in the end by sort of, bless you, sort of re-establishing the status quo. He is, again, a heterosexual. This is something we need to state, or that sort of sitcoms like that need to state again and again. Michel, before your arm falls off.
But it's also funny that he's like the humor with like maybe some homosexual vibes because he's the only not white person on this thing, because it's a sitcom and maybe they're trying to be more inclusive. That's, I think, Disney was very not inclusive until like a couple of years ago. I think the most inclusive one was like 1998 where they did Mulan, and then after that they did a long time nothing with like people of color or something like this, and then they started to do like Shang-Chi or like Encanto and now.
Or Princess and the Frog, which is a bit earlier.
Oh, Princess and the Frog, there was a big controversy because it was like she's the first black princess, but then most of the time she was a frog. So they were like very.
Also Mulan and Pocahontas. Anyways, so there is some kind of diversity, but especially Pocahontas, if you ever watch it under this sort of post-colonial headline and through the post-colonial lens, Pocahontas becomes a cringe-watching experience more like anything else. But especially with him, you have the double marginalization of being an effeminate man and being the ethnic other, so to speak. Yeah.
Also, that in Mulan she finds a guy. I think in a real it's from like I think a poem or anything. I don't know, a Chinese thing. She doesn't have a guy. In the real one, she doesn't have a guy. She just goes back to her father, and now it's like, oh my God, she needs a guy because why not? Because
it's a Disney movie. It needs to have a happy ending. You know, if she's a Disney princess, are you a Disney princess if you don't get the guy in the end?
Frozen.
Moana. Also the same thing. Anyways, yes.
I don't know if this was intentional on your part, but I think it's also important to point out that each one of these people are really bad at their job. Like James Bond is like the most well-known spy on Earth, obviously not good. Indiana Jones is responsible for destroying a bunch of excavation sites. Captain America is actually excluded from the Avengers at a certain time point. Chris Pratt is, well, even the movie says he's the worst smuggler in the universe. Donald Trump wanted to nuke tornadoes, so I don't think that really qualifies him for the job. And then, I mean, I didn't watch Big Bang Theory, but I think Howard has an incident where he's like, he wants to date a girl, and then the Mars rover is kind of ending up in a cliffside, and then the Mars rover kind of already explodes, but in the cliff they find some water, and it makes him good at the job. But what I'm getting is he's really still bad at his job. So I don't know, was that intentional?
That, of course it was intentional. No, it wasn't, but I didn't think about that actually. Yeah, they are pretty bad at their jobs. It's also good. The moment I said they're pretty bad at their jobs, I could see from the corner of my eye 2 hands going up. And now they went down a little. Yes?
Also, they are white.
Huh? White. Yes. Hannah.
Because you mentioned that in the end they always, like most female characters, always find the dude, no matter the plot. For most of these men, women do not matter. Like there might be a romance. I think Indiana Jones had like one part there was a woman, but it didn't like in the end it didn't matter. Like she was not part of the storyline whatsoever, and they were never mentioned. Oh, okay, Star-Lord, okay, Big Bang Theory,
Maybe.
yeah, but the relationships were weird anyways, but
I think
that doesn't really matter.
I think the only woman I know from Big Bang Theory is literally the one that's on the picture. I think Sheldon has another girlfriend. I know that, but.
Yeah, a lot of them are really, like good comes with independent. For them it doesn't matter, but for most female characters, the partner that's.
Okay, so partners and emotional attachment doesn't really matter. Yeah.
Also, in the series, most of like the female characters, like except Amy, the girlfriend of Sheldon, are like portrayed as a bit stupid. Well, no, the wife of Howard is also biochemical thing stuff. It's a job, but they're all blonde and tiny, and they work in like restaurant jobs where they get sexualized and stuff. So.
Yep, that sounds like a series that I'm very glad I didn't watch until the end. Yeah. So they are not women. That's probably one of the
Best traits.
Yeah, that's one of the best traits. It's also interesting when it comes to James Bond. I think one of the controversies about No Time to Die was that the new 007 is a woman. Ooh, no, how terrible. Yeah.
I also don't know if I've ever seen any one of those guys cry. Yeah, like being aggressive, or I don't know, having the feeling of having to revenge someone, yes, but not really crying.
Yeah.
But and also like just generally being emotionless, but being angry or aggressive is not an emotion. So because like that's totally normal, that's manly. You can be aggressive, that is not an emotion. But as soon as you show anything else, no, that's not manly. You cannot do that.
Aggression is only an emotion for women. Didn't you know that?
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, my fault.
That's what I'm here for. Yes.
Also for James Bond and Indiana Jones, women are usually more like a plot line, and they get with many women, especially James Bond is very known for having a new girl every movie, and but they don't really face consequences for that, or it's not viewed in a negative sense, as for like a female hero would maybe find the love of her life in the movie, but it's usually not portrayed that she has like more than one love interest at the same time that she really pursues. Maybe there's another guy or a second lead or something, but it's not really that she really has any romantic contact with more than one person. It's always very negative for women to have like more than one partner or romantic interest. As for men, it's desirable, and it just shows how great they are because all women want them.
Just calling it virile and sexual. Yeah. Michelle?
I also want to stand with the new Indiana Jones that is maybe a woman, also like Doctor Who, there was a big thing that the new Doctor Who is a woman, but everything before is like a man with an assistant who is a girl, who's always a woman. And I did not watch all of Doctor Who, I think. And the thing was that the last assistant, she was like then married, happily married, and then she had to give up like being an assistant because she was not married and could not help the doctor.
Yep. Women always strive for commitment and relationships and are certainly concerned with, you know, family and getting the guy, and also not just getting the guy, being in a relationship. It's not friends with benefits and then I do my career kind of thing, but it's always the marriage, white picket fence, a dog, and 2.5 kids. That's the ideal that women strive for. It's commitment, as in long-term commitment. Yep.
Yeah, maybe in addition to that, before the doctor became like a woman, there was the controversy that he was an old man, or like an older man, like not in his 20s to maybe early 40s, but like a little after that, like 50, 60-ish kind of. Like he had gray hair, oh no.
Dirty old man.
Yeah, like, so like the ideal for men maybe that you have to be young or younger, or maybe reaching into the wonderful saying, men, they
age like fine wine.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah. You know how it goes on? Men age like fine wine and women like cheese. The moment the mold sets in, they need to be discarded.
Oh my god.
Interesting that you said younger or young. I would definitely agree with you. There is this, and we'll get to that when we talk about older men and aging masculinities. Usually the narratives about masculinity and how to be an ideal man end at middle age. So usually the capping off point is literally retirement age. Everything that comes afterwards, all of that kind of still is important, but it all changes because there are no narratives of how to be a proper man after the age of 65 usually. So that's a very good observation that all of these men, but this guy, are pretty young. But it's also interesting that we didn't really talk about this guy. But you said that they're younger, and he always projected this image of being not 70, but younger with his lovely hairdo. Yes?
But also like this thing with like silver fox, like everything, like if a man is getting older, it's like, oh, it's like daddy issues also with everything, and like also like MILF is not more thing for like women than for men.
It's also, you don't call older men DILF or daddy I'd like to fuck, but you usually call them silver, as you just did, silver fox, or you know, usually other connotations and not the connotation about their familiar position in some way. Also, there was a series a couple of years ago called MILFs and something else. It was a RTL series that was very weird, and they had older women being women above the age of 40, and I thought, bodes well for women in this case. Anyways, yes?
I think older men with like many partners are called experienced, and women with many partners are like called like worn out.
Yeah.
So I think that's also like men are just like desirable, and women shouldn't be desirable, but like should, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Men stay desirable for a very long period of time, you know. People like Mick Jagger still, or people like this guy, still get women, younger women in particular, because they have this, yes?
No, like, there just came to mind like a statistic I once saw, which was like, which age are women attracted to at what age? And it was like a steady incline, it went like, maybe usually like a few years older than themselves they were attracted to, and then they did the same thing with men, and it always stayed like kind of in 20-ish.
That was disgusting. I also saw that.
Interesting. I just had to think of James Bond and the way his age rises throughout the films, and how the age of his love interest stays roughly the same. And I think there's one James Bond actor, Roger Moore, who said he was really uncomfortable acting. I think he was in his mid-50s, and he was really uncomfortable having a love interest in his 20s. So he has this really strangely paternal role in this movie where he goes like, please dress warmly, please do that, go to bed, don't do anything, don't try to seduce me or anything. So he was really uncomfortable with it, but usually the James Bond actors got older while their love interests stayed roughly the same age, which is still okay. I mean, you do you, and all May to December relationships, that's totally fine, but generally that is one of the, women need to stay young, men can age generally, yes.
But I also think like with like fathers and moms in like movies, the movie moms are also very young. I watched some where they're like, yes, she played her mom, but she's only like 5 years, the actress is like 5 years older than her. And like the man is always, you can see that it could be her father because he looks like he could have a child. But the like Peter Parker's aunt in the new one, I think the actress is like not even in her 40s, so she looks very young.
Okay.
And everything. I thought was very weird. That the one thing was like, I think this was Laura Dern, and she played Reese Witherspoon's mom, and she's like 6 years older than Reese, and I was like, that's not believable.
Also, Laura Dern doesn't look that old. Huh. Anyways, on that positive note, Laura Dern is always a positive note to end something on. I'd say we'll finish up Later Life, not Later Life, but Masculinity next week. Have a good week and see you later.